From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The situation in eastern Aleppo is really so horrendous. I mean, it's beyond words. I think we're all struggling to say anything new about it because it's so unremittingly awful. Despite the occasional let-ups, overall the picture is horrendous.
As the United Nations says nearly 1 million Syrians are living under siege and the last remaining hospitals in eastern Aleppo have been destroyed, we'll get an update from a physician in touch with medical personnel in Aleppo and speak with Syria analyst Bassam Haddad. Then, as Trump's victory and early cabinet picks embolden white supremacists and threaten reproductive rights, we'll speak with Catherine Franke, director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia University. And how could Obama's surveillance state and the authorization of military force be expanded under President Trump? We'll speak with Hina Shamsi, director of the American Civil Liberty Union's National Security Project. Then to the militarized standoff at Standing Rock.
My name is Leland Brenholt. I'm a medic here at Ocheti-Sakowin, and we have seen at least 4 gunshot wounds. 3 of them I know to the face and head. Rubber bullets. Right now we're trying to keep people warm. We're trying to get them decontaminated and treating all kinds of different wounds. People have been hit with canisters in the chest or the leg and that sort of thing.
As medics treat those wounded by police, we'll get an update from the father of 21-year-old activist Sofia Walensky, who is in critical condition after reportedly being hit by a concussion grenade during a police attack on water protectors. And as we head into the Thanksgiving weekend, we'll speak with Indigenous historian and activist Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, author of All the Real Indians Died Off, and 20 other myths about Native Americans. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Amy Goodman is on assignment and will return on Monday. South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley has reportedly accepted President-elect Donald Trump's offer to be the ambassador to the United Nations, making her the first woman to be picked for his cabinet. The first 5 appointments were white men. Haley, the daughter of Indian immigrants, has almost no foreign policy experience except for making 8 trips overseas to discuss economic development opportunities. During the presidential race, she supported Florida Senator Marco Rubio, but later said she voted for Trump. If confirmed by the Senate, she would be replaced by South Carolina Lieutenant Governor Henry McMaster, a major ally of Trump. This comes as Trump has reportedly asked retired neurosurgeon and 2016 Republican presidential candidate Ben Carson to consider taking the position of Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Carson has no government experience and no experience with housing or urban policy. Trump held an on-the-record meeting with reporters and editors at the New York Times office Tuesday after briefly canceling the meeting earlier that morning. In the interview, Trump said he would not seek to prosecute Democratic presidential candidate and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, despite spending months threatening to jail her and inciting crowds to chant lock her up" during his campaign. At the Times building, Trump also defended his chief strategist, Stephen Bannon, claiming he did not think Bannon was racist, but instead thought he was a decent guy. Nevada Senator Harry Reid has called Bannon a champion of white supremacists, and the Southern Poverty Law Center has called Breitbart Media, which Bannon headed, a, quote, white ethno-nationalist propaganda mill, unquote. Trump also attempted to distance himself from white supremacists who have celebrated his victory, including during a white supremacist conference over the weekend, in which participants used the Nazi salute and quoted Nazi propaganda in the original German. Meanwhile, CNN is under fire over a segment on white supremacist Richard Spencer, during which the lower third on CNN's screen read, quote, alt-right founder questions if Jews are people, unquote. Spencer has said he has a psychic connection with Donald Trump. After widespread backlash, CNN called the caption, quote, poor judgment. A member of Donald Trump's transition team, Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, has accidentally revealed his proposed strategic plan for the Department of Homeland Security, which includes an ideological extreme vetting test for immigrants seeking to enter the United States and reinstating a registry for immigrants from majority Muslim countries. Kobach was photographed carrying documents outlining this strategic plan into a meeting with Trump on Sunday. Following 9/11, Kobach himself helped design the registry for immigrants from Muslim-majority countries, known as the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, or NSEERS. Under the program, more than 10,000 Muslims were deported and more than 80,000 were spied on. The Department of Homeland Security abandoned the program in 2011 after deeming it ineffective. Nearly 200 organizations are now calling on the Obama administration to rescind the legal framework for the registry before Obama leaves office, so Trump's administration cannot reinstate the program. New York City is spending more than $1 million a day to protect Donald Trump and his family at Trump Tower, where the New York Police Department has set up barricades and patrols amid frequent protests. City officials say these costs will continue even after Trump's inauguration, as his wife, Melania Trump, and their son, Barron, are expected to continue living in Trump Tower. In Wisconsin, a court has ruled the state legislature engaged in unconstitutional gerrymandering to favor the Republican Party when it redrew the state assembly districts in 2011. The case is likely to go to the Supreme Court. Baggage handlers at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport have announced plans to go on strike next Tuesday, changing their original plan of striking on Thanksgiving. The move avoids a strike at one of the world's busiest airports on one of the year's busiest travel days. The Service Employees International Union is backing the workers, who want to raise their wages to $15 an hour. This comes as Germany's main airline, Lufthansa, cancelled nearly 900 flights today after pilots went on strike to demand a pay increase. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of fast food workers, home care and child care workers in 340 cities will join the Chicago airport workers on Tuesday for what they're calling a national day of disruption. The protest marks the 4th anniversary of the movement to raise wages, known as the Fight for 15. Hundreds more across the U.S. are planning protests on Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, which is considered a major shopping day in the United States. In Chicago, activists are planning a Black Friday boycott along Michigan Avenue to demand police accountability. Water protectors fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota have also declared a global day of action on Friday, calling for protests at banks financing the $3.8 billion pipeline and at the offices of sheriff's departments who have sent deputies to police the ongoing resistance, which is led by the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota. In news from Iraq, the United Nations says as many as 68,000 civilians have been displaced from Mosul amid the ongoing fight by Iraqi security forces, backed by the U.S. Special Operations soldiers and U.S. airstrikes to retake Mosul from ISIS. The UN says half of those displaced so far are children and warns that hundreds of thousands more may be displaced in the coming weeks. This is Abu al-Abid.
We fled from the Aden neighborhood. We fled on foot, and the army then transported us by truck and brought us here. Thank God. The situation is good. Clashes are still going on, but the army will prevail, God willing.
In Yemen, at least 19 people have died in fighting on the outskirts of Taiz as a 48-hour ceasefire expired. The ceasefire never completely halted U.S.-backed Saudi-led airstrikes nor offensives by the Houthi rebels. Britain's High Court began hearing a lawsuit Tuesday filed by more than 40,000 Nigerians demanding oil giant Shell clean up spills that have contaminated water with cancer-causing chemicals, including benzene. The lawsuit was launched by the Ogale and Bil people, who allege Shell has poisoned their water during decades of drilling in the Niger River Delta. In Peru, authorities have declared a state of emergency in 7 districts in the north amid raging wildfires. Scientists say the fires are fueled by less rainfall due to climate change. The fires are threatening indigenous land and crops in the Peruvian Amazon. This is the Peruvian Prime Minister.
In the first place, because of the magnitude of the fire's reach, the government has declared a state of emergency in the zones affected by the greatest intensity and risk. This will permit the national government to continue mobilizing people, resources, and diverse equipment in order to confront these fires and attend to the population that has been affected.
Pakistan says Indian Army shelling in Kashmir has killed at least 9 civilians and injured 9 more after an artillery shell hit a bus Wednesday. The Pakistani officials say the Indian Army also attacked the ambulance that arrived on site. Fighting between Pakistan and India in the disputed Kashmir region has been escalating for months. And in Ohio, a prosecutor says he'll retry white former University of Cincinnati police officer Ray Tensing for murdering 43-year-old Samuel Dubose. Officer Tensing shot Dubose in the head after pulling him over for having a missing front license plate in 2015. Tensing was wearing a T-shirt emblazoned with a Confederate battle flag under his uniform when he fatally shot Dubose. A judge declared a mistrial in his case earlier this month after the jury was unable to reach a verdict. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Amy Goodman is on assignment and will return on Monday. We begin today in Syria, where the United Nations is warning nearly 1 million Syrians are living under siege, double the number last year. The vast majority, 850,000 people, are being blockaded by the Syrian government. On Monday, the UN Human Rights Agency said civilians trapped in eastern Aleppo, where the last hospitals have been destroyed by Syrian government bombing, are facing annihilation. On Tuesday, the UN spokesperson Rupert Colville said the attacks on hospitals, if proven deliberate and as part of a systematic pattern, could amount to war crimes.
The situation in eastern Aleppo is really so horrendous. I mean, it's beyond words. I think we're all struggling to say anything new about it because it's so unremittingly awful, despite the occasional let-ups. Overall, the picture is horrendous, and the fact that these hospitals and clinics have continuously been hit is a matter of very, very grave concern.
The World Health Organization says the Syrian government's intense bombing campaign against eastern Aleppo has damaged and shut down the area's only remaining hospitals, leaving 250,000 people trapped without access to medical care. Doctors warn the damaged hospitals may not be able to reopen. This comes as Syrian government forces have surrounded eastern Aleppo, which is rapidly running out of food, fuel and water. Meanwhile, on Sunday, the government of Bashar al-Assad said it had rejected a proposal by the UN Special Envoy for Syria, which called for eastern Aleppo to be granted autonomy if jihadist fighters linked to al-Qaeda withdrew and the fighting stopped. Well, for more, we're joined by 2 guests. In Chicago, Dr. Zahir Sahlul is founder of the American Relief Coalition for Syria and senior advisor and former president of the Syrian American Medical Society. He's visited Aleppo 5 times since the war began. He was a classmate of Bashar al-Assad in medical school. And in Washington, D.C., Bassam Haddad is director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University. He's co-founder of Jadaliyya and director of the Arab Studies Institute. He wrote a piece for The Nation last month headlined, "The Debate Over Syria Has Reached a Dead End." He's also the author of Business Networks in Syria, The Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience. Welcome back to both of you to Democracy Now! Dr. Zahir Sahlul, I'd like to begin with you to go over what we said in our introduction, namely the state of hospitals in eastern Aleppo. According to the World Health Organization, there are no functioning hospitals left in East Aleppo. And you were last on the show in August when you said the situation in Aleppo was, quote, 10 times worse than hell. Could you tell us what you know of the situation in East Aleppo today, and in particular the state of medical facilities?
It's even worse than last time, and really words at this point do not mean anything. The use of catastrophic or beyond description do not mean anything because we're talking about a city that has 300,000 people, among them 100,000 children who are trapped with no food or medicine for the past 4 months and a half, and everyone is watching them with indifference. That's at least what they perceive. So we're talking about all hospitals in Aleppo right now that have capacity to treat victims of bombing that are destroyed, including the hospital that I spent last medical mission and with my colleagues. That was M10 hospital. It was a hospital underground for protection of doctors and nurses, and it was completely destroyed. That hospital used to perform 4,000 surgeries, life-saving surgeries every year. In the last 2 days, 2 more hospitals were destroyed, which are the largest hospitals that are doing surgeries and taking the trauma patients. Every day there are massacres, and right now the space for treating these patients is shrinking, in addition to the shortage of the medicine, IV fluid, antibiotics, pain medicine, suture sets, and of course the shortage of doctors. Every 17 hours right now in Aleppo, there is a targeting of healthcare facility. Every 60 hours, there is a targeting and killing of a healthcare worker. In the last 144 days, there were 143 attacks on healthcare facilities in Syria committed by the Syrian government and its ally, mostly Russia, and 1/3 of them happened in the city of Aleppo. So right now, to be a medical worker in Syria is the most dangerous job on earth. And in spite of that, we have doctors and nurses in Syria and Aleppo especially who want to continue to save their lives, but they need to be protected.
So, Dr. Sahlul, could you say then where people are going now? You're in touch with medical personnel in East Aleppo. Where are people going now to seek medical treatment?
There are still small medical facilities that are open and treating patients. They're semi-destroyed or partially destroyed. There are some basements of buildings that our doctors are treating their patients. When I was in Aleppo, I visited 7 medical facilities. These are hospitals that were in Aleppo before the crisis. And so few of them are very small, and they do not have the capacity to treat victims of trauma or victims of chemical weapons, as we were seeing in the last few days. But in spite of that, they are opening some of their spaces that are not destroyed to keep accommodating the patients. Healthcare is one essential part that keeps a city going. And if you destroy every facility or medical facility, that means you are destroying the neighborhoods, you're destroying the city. And that's why it's very crucial to keep anything that will keep providing medical care to the civilians in the city available.
I'd like to bring in Professor Bassam Haddad, Director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies Program at George Mason University, and also co-founder of Jadaliyya. Professor Haddad, on this site, Jadaliyya, which you co-founded, you and your colleagues have been documenting developments in Aleppo. And you point out on the site that in addition to the carnage in East Aleppo, there have been repeated attacks on the government-controlled side of Aleppo, West Aleppo. What do you know of the scale of these attacks and who's carrying them out?
Thanks, Nermeen. Well, clearly there's been Islamic of Western Aleppo by the rebels, and the issue here, or the point here, is that these, of course, pale in comparison to the brutal bombardment of eastern Aleppo and the almost total destruction of life. The issue is not necessarily one to create any kind of parity, but it reveals a lack of reporting in Western media about that kind of direction of shelling into Western Aleppo. But the more significant point, as my co-panelist, if you will, has just shared, is that what we are witnessing in Aleppo today, and especially in East Aleppo, of course, is nothing short of a slaughter. And that is, unfortunately, when I was here 3 weeks ago on the show, I had discussed that we had not seen then anything yet compared to what is likely to happen. And I fear that this will continue, this viciousness will continue until the regime and Russia take over eastern Aleppo, because it is considered a necessary step to prop up their position in any future negotiation before, during, or after the takeover or the Trump administration comes into effect.
And that is a chilling prospect given what needs to happen in order for Aleppo to fall. The rebels will not give up. The regime and the Russians will go to any length to not just take over, but the idea here is to destroy life in itself. And we see that with the targeting of hospitals that cannot be but deliberate in this situation.
Professor Haddad, could you say a little more about what you expect will happen given the intransigence of the regime and other parties involved? What do you think will happen in East Aleppo?
I mean, it's as my colleague said, we are all in a loss for words. I mean, there's nothing that could describe what actually might happen if this onslaught continues. But at a strategic level, the Syrian regime and the Russians will not stop until this, it seems that they will not stop until eastern Aleppo is within their control. And it is important to note that the regime and Russia today have overlapping interest in doing so. However, it is also important to recognize that there might be a rift after that point, because the degree to which they both want to conquer all of Aleppo is very similar. But in any future process, it seems like Russia is much more interested in focusing on stability and some sort of control of the situation in Syria, whereas the regime is mostly interested in reconquering the entirety of Syria and reestablishing itself and certainly its survival. And that might actually open the door for some negotiation. But I fear that if this is the case, if the entirety of Aleppo is captured, it will leave in any scenario very little room for negotiation at a time when no international power, and certainly the U.S., neither have the will or the interest in doing very much to stop this. So there is this theater that people are asking the United States to intervene and to do more, but in reality, neither is there a will, nor is there any kind of desire to stop this process. And it seems that there is a consensus, not just against the revolution, as people say. People are always concerned about the revolution, but there is a consensus against the well-being of Syria and Syrians, with or without the revolution or the regime, for purposes that are mostly geopolitical. Because as we know, before 2011, all the parties that supposedly today are trying to defend Syria or fight for Syria or help the revolution in Syria were supporting the Syrian regime, from the Arab Gulf states to the United States at various times.
Well, before we talk about the role of the U.S. in Syria, I'd like to ask Dr. Sahlul about comments that some have made that groups like al-Nusra and other extreme Islamist groups operating in East Aleppo are keeping people hostage and using them as human shields in East Aleppo. There have been reports that people in East Aleppo fear leaving for the western part of the city because they're likely to be detained there as terrorists. Dr. Sahlul, could you comment on that and what you know of the situation of people attempting to flee East Aleppo?
When I was in Aleppo in the last medical mission, just before the siege became a reality, I was there with two physicians from Chicago, Dr. John Kaler and Dr. Samuel Attar. We frankly did not see al-Nusra. We visited all hospitals in Aleppo, and it's dangerous for me as an American doctor to be in a situation where you have encounter with these terrorists. But we have not seen any signs for them, at least in the neighborhoods and the hospitals we visited. Now, there might be few fighters of al-Nusra in the city of Aleppo and around it, but that's not what is keeping the people in. Let's not forget that the population of Eastern Aleppo was 1.5 million before the crisis, and right now it's 300,000. That means the 1.2 million are already refugees or internally displaced somewhere in Turkey, in Europe, or in the rest of Syria. The 300,000 people are there because they don't have any other place to go. Even if they wanted to leave, where would they go? Turkey has sealed the border completely. Any other place in Syria is dangerous because the Russians and the Syrians have been bombing Idlib, for example, which is nearby. They cannot go to government-controlled areas because they can be tortured and detained, and of course that happened frequently. Previously in other places they were put under siege. And if they are let go, that's called ethnic cleansing, forced evacuation, according to the United Nations. It happened in Daraya, it happened in Ma'addamiyya, it happened in Zabadani, it happened in the old city of Homs. And right now we are witnessing what's becoming the next ethnic cleansing or forced evacuation in Syria. There might be some terrorist group or al-Nusra around Aleppo, but that's not what's keeping the people in. And what's keeping the people in, that they have no other place to go, and they are also trapped. They cannot go to any place that is safe.
And Professor Bassam Haddad, to return to the point that you raised about U.S. involvement in Syria, I'd like to quote from an interview with the Syrian writer and political dissident Yassin al-Haj Saleh. You pointed out that the U.S. has been supporting rebel groups in Syria, as of course they have. But he says in this interview with The Intercept, quote, "In many important ways, the Americans have been supporting Bashar al-Assad. The United States helped create a situation," he says, "in which Syria would be plunged into chaos, but the regime would remain in power." So could you respond to that and also give us a sense of what U.S. policy vis-a-vis Syria has been from the start of the uprising in 2011 to the present day?
Yes. Well, first, I respect the perseverance of Yassin al-Haj Saleh as a dissident who was imprisoned by the Syrian regime and suffered the structural brutality for 16 years by the Syrian regime. And I support the idea that the U.S. intervention has been anything but positive from the very beginning. And, you know, as I shared earlier, I mean, this has been, in my view, quite obvious. It's just that I also wish, based on the quote that you gave me, I wish that Yassin al-Haj Saleh has or had thought about this or provided it as an advice early on to the revolutionaries when they were tripping over themselves here next door down the street in Washington, D.C. to cozy up to U.S. policy makers in trying to move things in a particular direction, when in reality this was basically a moot point, considering exactly what Yassin al-Haj Saleh is saying right now. So in my view, that is not a controversial point, and the idea here is to move beyond this call for U.S. intervention and think about what is the real interest of Syrians, because everybody's bypassing the interests of Syrians. In fact, as a result of this kind of support by people like Yassin al-Haj Saleh for a more critical view, we are beginning to see a rift, if you will, between think tank analysts within the U.S. Supportive of a traditional establishment approach that seeks to secure, first and foremost, the security of Israel. We're beginning to see a rift between this group of supporters of the Syrian revolution and many Syrians who support the Syrian uprising and revolution, whereby the former group is much more interested in the outcomes of the revolution in relation to Iran's domination of the region or control and Israel's security, whereas the revolutionaries are much more interested in the well-being of Syrians. And this rift actually can be viewed by looking at how think tank analysts today are scrambling to oppose a Trump policy on the basis of not the Syrian people, not the health of the Syrian uprising, but on how it might produce positive effects. That is, Trump's policy might produce a positive effect for Iran, Syria, and their allies, including Hezbollah in the region, and how it would threaten Israel. This line of argument reveals from the reveals what has been the concern and the worry from the beginning of that kind of trajectory. And this is actually what we are witnessing today, and that quote is apt, a rift that should have existed from the very beginning for the sake of building a healthier, independent, and democratic uprising in Syria against a dictatorial regime.
And Dr. Sahlul, very quickly before we conclude, the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad commented for the first time on Trump's electoral victory last week, calling him, quote, a natural ally of his regime. So could you very quickly tell us what you expect from a Trump presidency vis-a-vis Syria?
Before that, we're calling for a day of solidarity with the doctors and nurses in Syria on Friday, where everyone should put a hashtag that never again is now to support medical medics in Syria. And this is something that is very important because committing war crimes against doctors and nurses should be rejected by everyone. It should not be normalized. Now, Trump has said that he will support President Assad. What kept the people in Syria hopeful of the future, the fact that there will be one day that they will have the same liberties and freedom that we have and enjoy in this country. And if this is removed, if Trump will be supportive of Assad and Assad will control the rest of Syria and he will declare victory and he will continue to be a president for the next 14 years as he has promised, then that will be really the last nail in the coffin of the aspiration of the Syrian people, the young people of Syria who rose up in the beginning of this 5 years ago for freedoms and liberties that we enjoy and we all support.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us. Dr. Zahir Sahlul, founder of the American Relief Coalition for Syria and senior advisor and former president of the Syrian American Medical Society. He's visited Aleppo 5 times since the war began and was a classmate of Bashar al-Assad. Bassam Haddad is director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program. Thank you so much for joining us. He's also associate professor at the Schar School for Policy and Government at George Mason University, co-founder of Jadaliyya and director of the Arab Studies Institute. He wrote a piece for The Nation last month headlined, "The Debate Over Syria Has Reached a Dead End." And when we come back, we turn to Trump's policies that are concerned, that people are concerned about, making white supremacy respectable again. That's the name of an article by Catherine Franke, who'll be joining us in the next segment. Stay with us. What Returned Nomads by Khabez Dol. President-elect Donald Trump met with journalists and editors at the New York Times Tuesday for a wide-ranging conversation that covered the election, Hillary Clinton, climate change, and foreign policy. One question focused on the growing movement in the United States that calls itself the alt-right. Critics say the group has been energized by Trump's win. When asked about the movement, Trump answered, quote, "I don't want to energize the group. I'm not looking to energize them. I don't want to energize the group, and I disavow the group. What we do want to do is we want to bring the country together because the country is very, very divided, and I'm going to work very hard to bring the country together. Concerns about the so-called alt-right were heightened after a conference that took place over the weekend in Washington, D.C., where hundreds gathered to celebrate Donald Trump's victory, and some attendees raised their arms in the traditional Nazi salute as leader Richard Spencer spoke.
America was, until this past generation, a white country designed for ourselves and our posterity. It is our creation. It is our inheritance, and it belongs to us.
Leaders of the self-proclaimed alt-right movement were also emboldened after Trump named Steve Bannon to become his chief strategist after first being his campaign manager. Bannon is the former head of the right-wing news outlet Breitbart Media. Well, for more, we're joined by Katherine Franke, director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia University. Her recent piece for the Los Angeles Review of Books is headlined, "Making White Supremacy Respectable Again." Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Katherine Franke. Could you tell us about this piece, Making White Supremacy Respectable Again? You wrote it in response to a New York Times opinion piece by your Columbia University colleague, Mark Lilla. Tell us what you found objectionable in the arguments he articulated in his piece, which was headlined, "The End of Identity Liberalism."
Well, thank you for having me on the show and for engaging this piece. You know, the arguments that Lila makes in the New York Times op-ed are not new. They resonate with arguments that were made in the late 1990s by the likes of Todd Gitlin or Michael Tomasky, who really felt like enough already of being bothered by special interests, whether that was women, people of color, gay and lesbian people. Let's get back to what made America great, which was liberal democracy that our founding fathers had in mind, and that this attention to racism, sexism, homophobia is really a distraction and a kind of surrender to self-indulgence that is counterproductive. For my colleague, Professor Lila, to issue this kind of op-ed in the New York Times at this time just struck me as enormously insensitive, both to the political situation we're in now, where Donald Trump's election signals the invitation of a kind of new white supremacy in this country, but even more than that, or parallel to that, what's going on at Columbia. I feel I'm worried about his students as he issues this op-ed in the same week that a number of young men on our wrestling team at Columbia were chastised and then discharged from the team for issuing the most ugly, sexist, racist, and homophobic tweets among themselves. So there's ugly hatred going on our campus. There's ugly hatred going on in this country, and Lila is collaborating and facilitating and rendering that hatred respectable again.
Well, I'd like to ask you about a specific point that he makes in the article, which is that during her campaign, Hillary Clinton explicitly referred to African-American, Latino, LGBT, and women voters, but in so doing, he writes, a large percentage of the American electorate were excluded, and according to Lila, this accounts in part for her defeat, since white working-class and evangelical voters voted almost across the board for Trump. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do, and you know, as my wise friend Suzanne Hoover said to me yesterday after she'd read the piece in the LA Review of Books, in a way what we're seeing here is a kind of seductive argument to well-intentioned liberals who are tired of feeling uncomfortable. They have a kind of identity fatigue. They're tired of being called out for their privilege. Let's get back to the kinds of forms of governance we're comfortable with. And those are the forms of governance that are white-led, and where the interests of white people figure at the center as the neutral norm.
Well, let's turn to President-elect Trump. Your response to the fact that yesterday to the New York Times he said that he disavows the alt-right movement and that Steve Bannon is not a part of it. Why do you think, first of all, why did he say that? Because that's not exactly what he said in the past. And do you think it indicates a shift away from Trump's association with white supremacy?
I guess we'll see. You know, on Monday he says one thing, on Tuesday he says another, on Wednesday we'll hear another thing. I don't have any faith from watching this man on a national political stage that any of this he feels deeply in his heart and will remain consistent in repudiating white supremacists like Richard Spencer or like Steve Bannon or like Breitbart News. Indeed, he's baking them into his administration with the kind of appointments that he's making of right-wing supporters of white supremacy and or appointing people with absolutely no experience or expertise to things like the UN representative, or excuse me, the U.S. representative to the UN, or Ben Carson at HUD, who knows absolutely nothing about housing. I mean, I guess I could do brain surgery, but very badly, right. Just as Dr. Carson could run HUD, but surely quite badly.
Well, what about Mike Pence, the second in command, the vice president-elect? There's speculation that, in fact, he may be the most powerful vice president in history in the United States.
Well, he actually knows a little something about how government works, both on the state level and on the federal level, which it's a low bar, but he certainly passes it. But if we can understand Donald Trump as a kind of robber baron who uses crony capitalism to undermine democracy, what we see in Mike Pence is the ascent or the victory of evangelical Christianity as a way to overcome underlying long-term commitment to democracy and pluralism, value pluralism in this country. So what I think what we certainly saw with Governor Pence in Indiana, and I think what we'll see with Vice President Pence in Washington, is the turn to religious liberty as a kind of delivery system for white Christian nationalism.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Catherine Franke, for joining us. Catherine Franke is director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia University. I want to turn to Obama's surveillance state and the authorization of military force and how it could be expanded under President Trump. During his meeting Tuesday with the New York Times, he also answered questions on foreign policy. When asked about his position on torture, Trump referenced a meeting he had with retired Marine Corps General James Mattis, considered a top pick for Trump's Secretary of Defense. Trump stated, quote, "General Mattis is a strong, highly dignified man. I met with him at length and I asked him that question. I said, 'What do you think of waterboarding?' He said, I was surprised, he said, 'I've never found it to be useful.' He said, 'I've always found, give me a pack of cigarettes and a couple of beers, and I can do better with that than I do with torture.' And Trump says, 'I was very impressed by that answer.'" Well, for more on Trump's foreign policy positions, we're joined now by Hina Shamsi, director of the American Civil Liberties Union National Security Project. So, Hina Shamsi, can you tell us some of your concerns about what a Trump presidency will mean for questions having to do, for instance, with this proposed plan for a Muslim registry, although he's gone back and forth on that, and it's very unclear what precisely he means by it now, and what the origins in particular of this Muslim registry system are, when the system was first put in place, and what you think is the likelihood that Trump will be able to implement it.
Of course, so much to discuss here, Nermeen, and thank you for having me again. One of the latest aspects of controversy that have come out, and let me start off by saying that I think it's very hard to know what the things are that candidate Trump proposed, which are deeply troubling and unconstitutional. We've, analyzed many of these proposals and are poised to challenge them should they be put in place. But let's take this registry. And what it is what you referred to earlier in the segment as the NSEERS program. And this was put in place after 9/11, and it was a program that was aimed at non-immigrant males who required them men from 25 countries, most majority Muslim countries, and required them to come in for fingerprinting and interrogation. It resulted in devastation. Approximately 13,000 people were slated for deportation. Families were torn apart. Small businesses were deeply negatively impacted. The impacts continue in communities today. Now, the program was discontinued in April 2011. It never, notably, resulted in any kind kind of criminal prosecution for terrorism, for example. And the Department of Homeland Security discontinued it and said that they were going to focus instead on targeting actual wrongdoing instead of these kinds of registrations and sweeps. Now, recently, it appears that this program is again under consideration. This is one of the things that candidate Trump talked about, that his advisors have talked about. And despite the fact that the program was stopped, there is a concern, a deep concern, one that is roiling minority communities around the country, that it could be reinstated. And so there is one very important thing that the Obama administration can do, and the ACLU, over 200 organizations, colleagues around the country have asked for this, which is dismantle the regulatory framework that still exists for NSEERS and is still in place, and make clear that it served little to no purpose, so that this program will be harder to reinstate again if the new administration is hell-bent on doing it.
Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us, Hina Shamsi, Director of the American Civil Liberties Union's National Security Project. When we come back, we turn to to North Dakota, and we'll be joined by two guests there. Please stay with us.
There's gotta be some hope. There's gotta be some hope. There's gotta be some way for you to send your dogs away and to leave the land alone. It's gotta be a crime somewhere in your heart you'll find. We're fighting for our right to keep the future bright and protect the ones we love. In the river is our sisters and our brothers.
In the River, a protest song by Ray Zaragoza. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Nermeen Sheikh, filling in for Amy Goodman. She's on assignment and will be back on Monday. In Minneapolis, 21-year-old activist Sofia Walinski has been undergoing a series of surgeries after reportedly being hit by a concussion grenade during the police attack against water protectors fighting the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota Sunday night. The Standing Rock Medic and Healer Council says 300 people were hurt in the attack, with the injuries including hypothermia from being sprayed by water cannons in sub-freezing temperatures, seizures, loss of consciousness, and impaired vision as a result of being shot by a rubber bullet in the face. On Sunday night, Sofia Walinski was evacuated and airlifted to a Minneapolis hospital after suffering a critical injury to her left arm. Photos show parts of Sofia's left arm nearly blown away, with her arteries, muscle, and bone exposed. A warning to our TV audiences: these photos are graphic. This is Army veteran Brandy King of the Fort Belknap Reservation, who helped transport Sofia after she was injured. King served in the U.S. Army for 8 years, including in a combat tour in Mosul, Iraq.
I can't even explain to you how I felt, because you don't really, I guess you don't expect those kind of wounds happening when they're not in combat. That was just felt like it was a combat wound, looked like it was a combat wound. She had shrapnel wounds. She didn't have any burns. Her arm was split open. Her skin, her flesh was ripped off of her arm. Her bones were broke.
The Morton County Sheriff's Department is claiming the police are not responsible for her injury and that concussion grenades were not used during the police attack. Well, for more, we're joined in Minneapolis by Sophia's father, Wayne Walensky. Mr. Walensky, thank you so much for joining us on Democracy Now! Could you tell us, first off, how your daughter, Sophia, is now?
She is resting, and she had a second surgery yesterday, so they could try to clean out the open wound. She still has an opening from her elbow to her wrist. There's no flesh there. And she's resting comfortably, and she will have a third surgery on Friday.
And Mr. Walensky, what about your response to the claims made by the Morton County Sheriff's Department that that the police were not responsible for the concussion grenades?
Yeah, they're ridiculous. Apparently, they've changed their story 3 times since the incident occurred. My daughter is very clear about the fact that she was being shot at the time. She's got bullet wounds on her body, and she was backing away at the time, and she was trying to reach for a shield so that the bullets wouldn't hit her at the time that the concussion grenade hit her in the arm and exploded. Witnesses that I've spoken to said that that the police officers, it takes 7 seconds for these concussion grenades to go off, and instead of throwing them on the ground, they pulled the plug, held them for 5 seconds, and threw them directly at her. So I'd say that the comments from the Morton County Sheriff's Department are utterly absurd and ridiculous and not worthy of a shred of belief.
And the doctors also found shrapnel in her wound?
Yes, her treating vascular surgeon told me after the surgery that he pulled as much out as he thought he could, and the second day was to clean it out and make sure that they didn't leave anything in there. They try to get you have to get all of the debris out, otherwise you can't, all the tissue will get infected and the whole arm will die anyway. So yes, he pulled all the shrapnel out. Apparently it went to pathology, so it's in the hospital records.
Well, Wayne Walensky, I want to ask you about the FBI agents who visited your daughter's hospital room yesterday. At least one of the FBI agents was wearing a jacket from the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Democracy Now! Reached out to the FBI Tuesday, but the agency refused to comment. Can you explain what the FBI agents were doing at the hospital yesterday?
Well, obviously it was a very intrusive and it was a very hard time, and Sophia was waiting to go to surgery. They're basically keeping us prisoner inside her hospital room, waiting for a warrant, which never came. They didn't tell us what they were there for many hours. Eventually, I got to speak to a supervisor and learned that what they were looking for was her clothing. And I did eventually consent. I had taken her clothing back to my hotel room the night before, and I did consent to give them the clothing eventually after talking to the supervisors. I have an unwritten agreement, but I put it in writing anyway, that they will give me access to those materials so that I could test them as well, and that they will preserve and not destroy that evidence, because I would want to see it and I would want to have it forensically tested myself.
And very quickly before we conclude, Mr. Walensky, what is it that you're demanding now?
Well, what I'm demanding is, number one, they clear that bridge, because it took many, many hours to get Sophia airlifted out of there, and there are people that are going to die there. They need to clear that bridge so that people can get to hospitals. They need to have the President Obama has to step in there and stop this. They're drilling now even though they don't have a permit. The Army Corps of Engineers has asked them to stop. The Army Corps of Engineers has said that they were not going to issue a permit until after they did further environmental studies and spoke with the tribe, and yet they go ahead and set all the drills in place, and they continue. They're probably drilling under the river right now as we speak. And it's a very, very dangerous situation there, and that's just thing number one. Number two is they have to demilitarize the police there. There's no reason that the police should be intentionally trying to kill people, maim people. And this has to stop.
Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us from Minneapolis, Wayne Walensky, father of 21-year-old activist Sophia Walensky. As much of the United States prepares to mark Thanksgiving this weekend, many Native Americans will gather in Plymouth to commemorate the 47th National Day of Mourning. This year is dedicated to water protectors at Standing Rock and to the struggle for recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day. To discuss this and more, we're joined in San Francisco by Indigenous historian and activist Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. She's the author of An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States and co-author of All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Roxanne. Could you tell us, as the nation prepares to observe Thanksgiving, a national holiday ostensibly meant to honor Native people, what are your thoughts?
Well, thank you for having me on the show. Actually, it's never been about honoring Native Americans. It's been about the origin story of the United States, the beginning of genocide, dispossession, and constant warfare from that time, actually from 1607 in Jamestown, until the present. It's a colonial system that was set up. There's a sort of annual calendar for this origin story, beginning with Columbus, October 12. Why celebrate Columbus? It was the onset of colonialism, the slave trade, and dispossession of the Native people of the Americas. So that is celebrated with a federal holiday. That's followed then by Thanksgiving, which is a completely made-up story to say the Native people welcomed these people who were going to devastate their civilizations, which is simply a lie. And then you go to President's Days, the Founding Fathers in February, and celebrate these slave owners, Indian killers. George Washington headed the Virginia militia for the very purpose of killing Native people on the periphery of the colony. Before, when it was still a Virginia colony. And then we have the big day, the fireworks, July 4th, Independence, which is probably the most tragic event in world history because it gave the world a genocidal regime under the guise of democracy. And that's really I'm a historian, so that's the historical context that I think we have to see Thanksgiving in, that it is a part of that mythology that attempts to cover up the real history of the United States. It actually, when it was introduced as a holiday by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, there was no mention of pilgrims and Native people or food or pumpkins or anything like that. It was simply a day for families to be together and mourn their dead and be grateful for the living. And I think that's an appropriate holiday that how people should enjoy it. But they should take Native Americans and Puritans out of the picture for it to be a legitimate holiday of feast and sharing with family and friends. So that's, the people at Plymouth. I send greetings to them. They have, for many years, I think it's almost 40 years now, that stood up and testified to the lie of Plymouth Rock, the Mayflower, the Pilgrims. And this is very hard for people to give up. This is the nationalism. It's actually Americanism is white supremacy and represents negative things. There's almost no way to reconcile it. It simply has to be deconstructed and faced up to, and otherwise there will be no social change that's meaningful for anyone.
Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, thank you so much for joining us, Indigenous historian and activist. That does it for today's show. Tune in tomorrow for our Standing Rock special. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Dina Guzder, Sam Alcoff, Robbie Caron, Hani Massoud, Charina Nadura, and Andre Lewis. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, and Paul Huckabee are our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Renee Feltz, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ariel Boone, Vesta Godars, Anthony Manzo, and Karl Marxer. Thank you so much. I'm Nermeen Sheikh, sitting in for Amy Goodman. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org.